We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got at least a few people who are sitting and watching the video.
I look like I'm running late, that's perfect. Oh, I don't even talk to the stick.
Well, welcome to Community Faith Conversations. This is a series of conversations to learn more about each other's faith traditions here in the greater Green Bay De Pere area. This is sponsored by St. Anne's Episcopal Church and by Gift, Gathered in Faith Together, an interfaith group from various church organizations and faith traditions in the greater Green Bay area. This year, mainly because of COVID, Gift decided that they would not do a Martin Luther King Jr. observance. So we thought that we would have this panel discussion focus on some of the things that Martin Luther King said and how our different faith traditions look at those, some of those ideas. So our panel members are Mary Claus. Mary's been a member of the Religious Society of Friends for the last 30 years. She is currently the clerk of Fox Valley Friends Meeting, which is the local Quaker meeting. She is active in religious education for children and prison ministry. Jody Figgins is founder of Open Heart Mindfulness Community, a local Buddhist Sangha modeled in the Plum Village tradition established by Thich Nhat Hanh. She is an ordained lay member of his Order of Interbeing. Rabbi Shana Bacharach is the Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Knesset Israel in Green Bay. She attended the University of Oklahoma and the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. And Green Bay has been her home for nearly 2 decades. Father Tyler Richards, rector of St. Anne's Episcopal Church. He holds a Bachelor's of English Literature from the University of Alabama and a Master's of Divinity from the University of the South at Sewanee, as well as a certificate in spiritual companioning from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. I am Mary Lynn Adams. I'm a deacon here at St. Anne's and a member of Gift, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's panel discussion. We have several prepared questions for our panel, but we will save some time if you want to offer some questions of your own, or if you want to provide some examples from your own faith tradition. Because we don't have anybody to run our AV equipment, we won't be able to take questions from the people online. So I apologize for that. But wait, we will. So if you're watching online and have a question or a comment, you can put that in the comment section, and through the miracle of electronics, we'll respond to that at the end of our panel discussion. So to begin with, I want to read a quote from Martin Luther King's A Letter from a Birmingham Jail. He wrote this in response to a group of clergy who had said that the civil rights movement should just wait, that the time wasn't right for these sorts of movements, that they should just simply bide their time. And Martin Luther King wrote his letter, and what he said is this, and I quote, "Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always right to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. And this was from 1963. So from the perspective of your faith tradition, I'd like our panel members to react to this statement. And Jody, if you would like to respond first.
I'm testing the mic. Is it working? Good. So I looked at this from the perspective of a couple of different questions. One is the view of timeliness of action, and the other, how it affects our actions in matters of social justice. So looking from our community, I'd first like to give you an example that Thich Nhat Hanh and the larger Sangha, how they reacted in the face of 9/11. So they were in California during this time, and they were confronted with all of the fear and all of the suffering, and the community was pressuring them to act in some manner, to speak out in some manner, and wanting to do so in an intelligent, compassionate, open, and loving manner. They first went in to refuge, and before crafting a response, they went to the beach. So they went to the beach and nourished themselves, played together, connected in with their body, and refreshed to come in so they were able to enter in and step into and hold the suffering that was around them, help the immediate people in front of them, and send messages out to the community throughout the world. So that's part of what we do, is starting right in front of us, right here, right now. Who is present? Where can we affect change? How can we step forward? And often that is even looking right inside of our own person. So when it comes to social justice, it's looking at our own biases, educating ourselves, showing up in the community, taking time to nourish, come back to our breath, rest in the three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, carry them with so we can enter in and know how to best respond with love and care and not anger or hatred or division or discord. We act, some of us are more intelligent in some ways, have more influence, and can go out. Imagine it as all one Sangha body, and each individual person making up all the cells of the Sangha body. And some of our strengths might be within ecology. Climate justice is one arm of action, others within the social justice. But together we move in and affect change. And we have our core of our practice and our Sangha, togetherness, the core of the body to hold us, to guide us, and to come in and making sure that we are resting and nourishing before we move forward.
I want to comment. Can you hear me through the mask okay? What really jolted me was that time becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. And when I look at the date of this letter and see the date of the march in Selma and the voting rights bill, which we're working hard for voting rights today, and it's like, so much time has passed. I mean, from the early 60s, Who would have thought that would be an issue today? The dignity of man in Judaism, as in all religions, it is so important to affirm the dignity of every human being. It is a sin to shame them or embarrass them publicly. There are times when it might have to happen, if you watched the hearings today. But in all seriousness, dignity of humans and to partake of a democracy, I mean, it's such a debasing of humanity to say you cannot participate in this democracy. And when I see how much time has passed, I know I'm not the only Southerner up here. I grew up in a different era, I suspect, because I grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi. And when I look out and I see the whole country is turning into Jim Crow, Mississippi, it's really scary. Time has not been on our side. We would have thought we had so much progress. Time doesn't sit still. It either moves forward or backward, never still. And that is the impetus to, we can't wait.
I'll just add that when I was discussing this with a fellow Quaker, he made the comment that how interesting it was that it was Martin Luther King, a black minister, who led the civil rights movement when it was based on scriptural beliefs that we all share, all religions share. But none of us took the action, none of us took the step. It had to be someone who was feeling the injustices and the oppression to get the motivation to act. And I guess it just made me think about that a little bit more. And the work that's going on today, anti-racism, it's not enough to just say you're not a racist and do nothing, but you need to actively step forward and put your actions, your beliefs into actions. I guess that's something Quakers try to do, but it's definitely difficult. And we probably should step up more.
So I'm going to date myself a little bit here. The reverse idea of dating to prove how young I am. Born in 1984 in Scottsboro, Alabama, the home of the famous Supreme Court case, the Scottsboro Boys, where a young white woman accused a group of young African-American men of assaulting her on a train, and with no evidence, with any sort of real due process, the three black men were taken out to the courthouse square and summarily hung. And it set off a civil rights case that is part of the precedents now. Growing up in Alabama, North Alabama, Central Alabama, where I went to college, I feel like I was sort of caught up in, even now, all these years later, caught up in the surf of the civil rights movement. And the first time I encountered a letter from a Birmingham jail, it was put into the context of me of this other document that Mary Lynn alluded to called A Call for Unity. And the idea of this document that Mary Lynn talked about was that it was a group of white male clergymen in Birmingham, Alabama. They all got together and wrote this piece talking about how the civil rights movement was unnecessary because that time would take care of it and they just needed to wait. And of course, I look back on it now and I go, what? But at the time, these men were acting, well, let's start with these men, were acting from a place of privilege. They weren't the ones that the police in Birmingham were setting the dogs loose on. They weren't the ones that were literally trapped under the boot of oppression. They weren't the ones that never knew when violence was going to be perpetrated against them. They were clergymen in Birmingham, Alabama, and they were all white. So the whole premise of A Call for Unity is absurd on its face. And then Martin Luther King prophetically writes this letter and saying, we can't wait on this. And I think about speaking as a member of the clergy who is also white and male, but hopefully have learned some lessons. I don't know how we look at the civil rights movement and say, you need to just hold your horses on this. You need to just wait. When we have all sorts of these scriptural precedents that talk about throwing off the yoke of the oppressor, about casting down the mighty from their thrones and lifting up the lowly. What is it that the Lord requires from you except to do justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Love your neighbor as yourself. So many of these ideas are universal to our faith, to our different faiths and our different beliefs. And yet we have this group of clergymen saying, it'll get better, just wait. And then we think about Emmett Till, and we think about all of the people's names who have been lost to history, who have been lynched, who have been persecuted, who have been destroyed, their families and their livelihoods destroyed because of race. And like Shana was saying, the fact that we're still dealing with this so many years on, that we're living in the age of Black Lives Matter and all of these continuing calls for solutions to this problem. As a Christian, I can't believe that we still have people sitting on the sidelines going, it'll get better. We just need to look the other way. No, I think that we should do justly now, and that we should love mercy now, and we should walk humbly now, and take a look at our neighbors and see how best to actually love them, and continue the work of Dr. Martin Luther King and say, what are we doing to each other? Never mind what are we doing to each other from a particular perspective, but can't we just look around and see the common humanity in one another?
In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize. And in his acceptance speech, he said, and I quote, "Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. I am not unmindful of the fact that violence often brings about momentary results. Nations have frequently won their independence in battle. But in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself." So Mary, would you say something with respect to this?
Yeah, thank you. All of our religions I know believe in not, acting peacefully, following, I guess, being humane to each other. But particularly with the Quakers, when it was started by George Fox in England, it was a time when fighting was just part of the norm. And in fact, they came to George Fox, it was Cromwell, came to George Fox and said, "Will you and your Quakers fight with me against the king?" And George Fox at that time said no, because the only battle he was interested in was the battle for men's souls. And that set off sort of a precedent within Quakers that we do not fight, try not to fight, and live nonviolently to resolve things. But we're very much focused, like Martin Luther King was, on the words of Jesus saying, "Love your enemies, Pray for those who persecute you. It's to make a friend with the other side. For all these reasons that Martin Luther King talked about, it's an unending cycle if you use violence to resolve differences. So we're very much in favor of having oppressed and oppressor meet in dialogue and talk things through and work things out. An example of how this was done within Quakerism was John Woolman in America during the time of slavery. Rather than talk about how terrible slavery was and working at it from that point of view, instead he took a trip through the South and he visited with slave owners and developed relationship with each of them and just talked to them. And then when he left, if there had been a Black person who had served him a meal or done something for him, he paid them for their service. So it wasn't a direct attack. It was through developing relationship, through dialogue, and through example that he tried to bring the two sides together. It's a slow process, but we believe that in the end, it will be a more lasting peace than if you just fight. And I guess that's a lesson I try to keep in mind every day today, as we're so often called to view others of our neighbors as our enemies when they're really not. So we need to keep those words in mind all the time.
There are times when violence as a way of self-defense is necessary, but as Dr. King said, it does not solve anything. When after the American Revolution, we had to govern. That was the hard part. We had to come up with a constitution. It was one thing to defeat the British, it was another thing to govern. You know, when it came to slavery, unfortunately in the South, and this is what comes of not seeing each other as human beings. In the South, Black people were not considered close to the equal of whites. When we first integrated my own school, the superintendent, there were 2 Black seniors that came to their school, and our superintendent called an assembly of the high school and said, we shouldn't hate them. They can't help it. They're not as smart as we are. I study anthropology. They have fewer convolutions in their brains. This is from the man running education for the whole district. When people dehumanize people and don't recognize the God-given dignity that we were all created in God's image, that God does tell us in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. This is for all of us to say, no, I am not better than others. I'm not worse than others. We are all human and worthy of dignity. And ultimately, that will be the only way to, the only thing that is going to win out. It does defeat itself. It does thrive on hatred. And hatred is, I really like to think, in the 10 Commandments and elsewhere in Torah, God points out that people may suffer from sin for the 3rd and 4th generation, which has more to do with, as I raise you, you will raise your kids, etc. But goodness lasts for 1,000 generations. Ultimately, goodness and love is stronger. We just have to push that as much as we can.
One of the 5 precepts of the Buddha is do not kill. And this includes humans, it includes animals, it includes, to the best of our ability, even single-celled organisms. So looking at violence, and who are we violent against? There are so many different roots within that makes up violence in a community. So when we practice and we look, we first see what's happening within ourselves. And then if we see something outside, acts of injustice against another person, against violence, we are called to do our best to act and speak out about those situations of injustice and to do what we can to help. Again, coming from a spot of peace, of looking at the roots and knowing that we are all, even those that people that we consider an enemy, we are all part of the same community. We are all people within Martin Luther King Jr.'s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community that he wished to create. And so by killing one person, we're killing ourselves. We are not separate.
All through Christian scripture, specifically the Gospels, and I'm thinking particularly during the Passion of Jesus, we see this issue of nonviolence coming up. I can't say that all of Jesus's ministry was nonviolent. There was that whole incident on Jesus clearing out the temple courts with a whip and driving people, the money changers and everyone out as he's trying to reclaim the Temple Mount as a space for prayer. But particularly in the Passion of Jesus and the moments leading up to Jesus, we see this streak of nonviolence coming true. Even as the troops and the soldiers are coming to arrest Jesus, Peter pulls his sword out of his sheath and chops off one of the guards' ears, and Jesus just says, "Put your sword back in your sheath." And then even goes as far as to heal the man's ear who has been chopped off. And then we see Jesus all through of these flagellations and all through these humiliations and being beaten and cursed and ridiculed, bearing the cross all the way through the streets of Jerusalem to the place of crucifixion. And even submitting himself to the horrors of crucifixion and crying out from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And so often I think of violence, and I try to reconcile that with the ministry of Jesus, and it's so much in line with what Dr. Martin Luther King talks about, is that violence doesn't solve anything. Of course, the disciples could have probably held off the guards for a little while, but then what happens next? Jesus still would have walked the road to Golgotha. Jesus still would have made the same choices that he made. If we're going to love our neighbors as ourselves, then going out and killing our neighbors doesn't seem like a very loving way of going about doing that. As Mary was talking about, finding a way to make a friend out of an enemy, trying to find a way to find common ground with one another, trying to find a way to put violence away. Jesus never explicitly speaks to the idea of nonviolence, but it's present inside of his ministry. It's present in the way that he deals with people that are in power, especially Roman centurions, who he even goes and heals their servants. Jesus is constantly operating under the umbrella, or not under the umbrella, but having to work within the influence of the Roman Empire that was known for their military might. And what do we see Jesus doing? We see Jesus demonstrating mercy. We see Jesus bringing in the outcasts, of healing those that were sick, and even speaking truth to power in love. So it feels like sort of the crip answer, but this signing on to everything Dr. Martin Luther King says as another Christian minister, but I don't know how in Christianity you can't look at the Gospels and say, there's no room here for violence. There have been a lot of doctrines that have been cooked up over the years of a way that we can have a just war theory, that certain conditions have to be met in order for war to be justified. I don't know that I can sign on with that. And I'm an Episcopalian, so I don't have to. So.
In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King gave a speech entitled "Beyond Vietnam." And in this speech, he said, and I quote, "Here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence, when it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see basic weaknesses of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition." What I'd like the panel to discuss are areas where perhaps others don't understand what your faith tradition has experienced, what you'd like to share with the public in general about your faith tradition and some of the challenges you've had. Shayna, you want to take the lead on this?
Shane, the mic's off.
But you won't be able to hear me. I do want to address the idea of learning from the opposition, because our holiest study books, Talmud, it's a very weighty, well, I'd say it's a huge series of books, but it's also all on my phone. I love the digital age. But it's composed of people looking for the truth, trying to understand Torah, the Bible, what God wants, etc. And it's arguments. And we follow the discussions, and one offers this, one suggests this, they go back and forth, and even the one that loses the argument, so to speak, that answer is still in the Talmud. Minority opinions, majority opinions, they're all there, and it's important to study them. And that's how Jews study. We try to study in pairs or groups where we can go back and forth and bat things around. If we all agree, we're not going to learn anything. So that's really important. As far as the idea of what the community deals with, there are so many little things. My husband went to the grocery the other day. The cashier said to him, "Merry Christmas." And then she remembered he has a yarmulke, he's Jewish, and she says, "Happy holidays." Well, the manager came out and did what you should never do, dress her employee down in front of the customer. And she says, "In our store, we say Merry Christmas," which really sounded like, oh, you really do have the Christmas spirit, don't you? Now, it's a threat. Our feeling is somebody says Merry Christmas. Okay, I don't celebrate Christmas. I really want to have a good day, and it's a pleasant reminder. So, there's no problem. But when the cashier, and Bob said, she was right. She really remembered, I'm Jewish and don't celebrate Christmas. She did the right thing. And there are so many little things like that. When many years ago, the City Hall had a nativity scene, and there's a lot of controversy because it's not a legal thing to do. There is separation of church and state. And I got a phone call, "Would you like to put up a menorah with our nativity scene to celebrate Hanukkah?" First of all, Hanukkah is not close to being the Jewish equivalent of Christmas. Second of all, Hanukkah was well over by the time he called me. And I said, "Why?" He said, "I'm trying to assert my constitutional right." This was the head of the aldermen at that time. And I kept writing, this guy's running the city council? But it wasn't about religion. It was about his constitutional right. at which point, this is where our group gift is so wonderful. We all got together and called the press and made a statement. We really believe in the separation of church and state. And when the mayor called a meeting of some of the clergy in town, every one of us, all, including his own priest, said, leave religion to us. You do the politics, we do religion, separate it. We were all agreed. It's in those little things, you hear it when, we all tend to stereotype or use expressions we don't think about. If you're trying to get somebody to knock the price down, you do them down. Well, that plays into a stereotype. Here's another dangerous stereotype. You keep hearing about all the conspiracy theories that George Soros is behind. Why do they pick on George Soros? He's rich, he's Hungarian, he's a Holocaust survivor and a Jew. That's become shorthand for Jewish conspiracy. And actually what I hear, I grew up in a world almost, even in Mississippi, unaware of any real anti-Semitism. But today we hear people co-opting the Holocaust as in, I have to protect myself with a face mask. That's like being a Nazi in the camp. It's like, there are so many things that people do that if they thought about it, that might be different. It's an attempt to dehumanize. That's the problem. We dehumanize people, and it's just so easy to do. The Anti-Defamation League, which was founded to fight anti-Semitism, there was a case in Atlanta. A young Jewish man was lynched for a crime he did not commit. And it terrified the Jews in Atlanta. It terrified everybody. And when we think of lynchings, we don't necessarily picture Jews, but they were. The Anti-Defamation League started to combat that. The Anti-Defamation League fights hate of every kind. They're there for everything. And they have literature and they do a lot of teaching. Our lesson is that, we have been discriminated against. Bible teaches, you are strangers in the land of Egypt. Therefore, you take care of the stranger in your own land. There is to be no other. You are all alike. You are all children of God, made in God's image. So that's how we overcome it. We be friends.
I believe it was in 1966 when Thich Nhat Hanh first wrote a letter to Dr. King explaining what was going on in Vietnam, sharing why the monks and nuns were immolating themselves, and asking for his support with the plea that we are all one large community, one family. And Martin Luther King started to speak out about the atrocities that were happening with the war in Vietnam. And regarding the part of the quote here about valuing compassion and nonviolence and see our enemy's point of view, that's something that as a community, the Plum Village engaged community of Buddhism was formed in the roots of Vietnam. And in the stripes of war and all of the killing and suffering, it was important to be able to connect and see every single person as they are and not as an enemy, and to preserve our compassion for every single person, even the person who have killed members of our community in targeted bombings. So that's one thing we try to hold on to, is keeping that compassion open for everybody and going to the roots and understanding that maybe we all have the same causes and conditions within us as humans, but we all don't have the same experiences. We all don't nourish ourselves, feed ourselves, have the same volition. And looking instead at the roots of what is causing the violence and effective change then and there. If we see our Uncle Joe saying something disparagingly about another group of people, speaking up in that moment and trying to form a connection, doing so in a way that doesn't cause division, it isn't from a place of judgment, it's from a place in a heart of trying to understand. In the local community, our Sangha is 10 years old. Here in Green Bay, there are a couple of other Buddhist communities that I know of. And for the most part, it's all been pretty welcoming. Going in, we're practicing at the Mothi Center, a yoga center. We were practicing in, at one point, a yoga studio, and Harmony Cafe when they were around by Goodwill on the other side of town. And so we've had acceptance in even places regional areas that we go to for retreats. I went to Siena Retreat Center to practice privately, letting them know I was participating in a virtual Buddhist retreat. And they're like, "Oh, wonderful, what do you need? What space, how can we support you?" And that's sorry, I don't know the specific denomination, but it is a Christian retreat center, and it's just completely welcomed with open arms. And in our community of practice, it's not just Buddhists. One of our trainings is letting go of attachment to views and including Buddhist ones, and teachings, not holding on to specific teachings if it doesn't relate in our own life, including Buddhist ones, and instead our life and what we see, the flower, the tree, the person in front of us, they're just as important as anything we can read in a sutra, probably more important. That's our direct experience. So we have people come and practice with us from all different faith traditions. So we're a wonderful fruit salad, I like to think of it. And somebody at work was very surprised. They don't know what to say to me, like around Christmas. And I was trying to explain, like, the tree isn't exactly non-religious. And, they just don't understand, and just have some of these conversations. And I've worked with some people for many years now, and even still, somebody's like, "Oh, you celebrate Christmas?" I'm like, "Yes, I celebrate Christmas. I'm also Catholic." And so it's usually a place of trying to understand. And some people, if they just, when it comes up in conversation, it's not anything I advertise. Some people they don't know what to say, and I just leave it there and we just move on. But for the most part, it's been very accepting.
I guess within the Quaker tradition, we focus a lot on individual connection to the spirit and listening to what God is asking us to do. And I think that leads more to individuals taking on particular callings and facing discrimination in our society because of what they are trying to do. I don't feel like we have faced discrimination as a group, in recent times. An example is during the Vietnam War, a woman, a Quaker from Madison, Ellen Boardman, took to heart the plight of the North Vietnamese and banded with a group of other Quakers from around the country to go and deliver supplies, medical aid and things in a boat to North Vietnam. And I thought that was, what a wonderful thing. But then I read her book about the experience and realized her family, her young children who were in school, all experienced a lot of backlash from the community for what she was doing, and it was really hard on the family. So I feel like there's more, it's discrimination in the sense of not following a path that fits with society at the moment on an individual basis.
So back to the question, has your local faith community experienced discrimination or conversely favorable treatment? Can I say no comment? The thing about Christianity is that so often Christianity gets a pass. People use their Christian faith as a political platform to get votes. People use their Christian faith to get all sorts of societal pats on the back. And so the idea of Christianity receiving favorable treatment is well established and is well stated. One of the things that Christianity is learning as we go is what it is to be a declining voice in the world. Christianity as a faith is, at least as far as the mainline Protestant denominations are concerned, is in decline. And it doesn't mean that our influence has waned at all, but we're beginning to see that downward slope of what it means to be a voice that is beginning to diminish in the world, and how we take our place with the other voices that are all crying out in truth, instead of trying to silence other voices. Shifting from the idea of Christianity being this one big pot that we're all in, down to the idea of the Episcopal Church. First of all, you say Episcopalian in a mixed room and people say, oh my God, what is that? Can you catch it? Because we are one of the smallest denominations in the Christian faith. A lot of people don't know who we are. There's been a lot of stereotypes that have been promulgated over the years. Episcopalians, that's just Catholic light, or that's B-team Catholic, or as Robin Williams put it, it's all of the ritual and none of the guilt. And my favorite one is, well, the Episcopal Church is a big tent, which also leads to sometimes the argument, well, Episcopalians are so open-minded that they don't really believe anything. And that's not true in the least. We have our own set of creedal ideas. We have our own set of beliefs and practices, just like every other faith group, and things that make us distinct in the world. But at the same time, we also have things that have set us apart, that have brought discrimination on us as a church. Denominationally, we made the decision that we are LGBTQIA plus affirming. It's one of the things that's pretty across the board true of Episcopalians. We practice women's ordination, which in some Christian denominations, it's something that people still look at and clutch their pearls over. As a whole, as a denomination, we're a fairly progressive church. Now, that is not a blanket statement to say that there aren't Episcopalians, faithful Episcopalians that have conservative viewpoints. We are a big tent. We do try to welcome different points of view so that we can all gather around issues and say, okay, well, where is God in all of this? How do we practice our faith inside of the tent of the Episcopal Church that is inside the larger tent of Christianity? There are Episcopalians of all shapes and stripes. We're trying to do this as one people. We're trying to do this as one faith group. And so it's not always easy to be an Episcopalian. Robin Williams also said, well, if you believe something as an Episcopalian, the good news is you can probably find one other person to agree with you. And that's probably true, because we do accept a broad spectrum of opinions on things. It leads us to richer places of conversation. It leads us to be able to walk together and hold things in tension, to hold complicated points of view and still say, at the end of the day, we're all children of God. We're all trying to live out what Christianity teaches us. How do we do that? Oh, and it's not always easy. Sometimes it's quite complicated. But holding that space of being a place where we do the things that we do because Jesus teaches us what Jesus teaches us can sometimes be complicated. And that's okay. So long as we're respecting the dignity of every human being, which is part of the promises that we make as Episcopalians, and respecting our ability to hold different ideas and different opinions, I think that we're moving in the right direction. But again, our discrimination as Christians is so minimal on the spectrum. You have to go back a long time to find any sort of whisper of discrimination against Christians that, honestly, I don't even think it merits mentioning. I think that we as a body have a lot that we need to look at in terms of our history and how we may have actually empowered and have engendered discrimination. Hence, back to our first question of what Martin Luther King was responding to in his letter from a Birmingham jail.
Well, we're almost up with our hour. I'm sitting here thinking, well, we've got two preachers and two people who sit in silence. It's kind of an interesting combination. So just briefly, I'd like each of you to react to this final quote from Martin Luther King, and this is from 1959, and this was something that he wrote entitled "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." But I think that this statement is probably true for all of our faith traditions. And he says, and I quote, "Through our scientific and technological genius, we've made of this world a neighborhood. And now, through our moral and ethical commitment, we must make of it a brotherhood. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools." Would you like to react to that?
I'll try not to react, but I'll respond at least.
Respond.
One of the things that Mary Lynn and I were talking about as we were making preparations for this evening was the idea of Christian exclusivism, the idea that Christians somehow have gotten a corner on the market when it comes to a relationship with God, the divine, the other, whatever we name that which is greater than ourselves. And as I was sitting there scratching my head, I was thinking to myself, okay, if I buy into the argument that Christians have a corner on the market and we have any claim to exclusivism, then how do you justify that? And as I started rolling back the clock and thinking about the history of Christianity, you go back to the Protestant Reformation and we broke off into all of these different groups. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe that's when things started to get a little dicey about what Christianity is. And I said, no, wait a minute. I have to go back further than that. And I go back to this idea of the Great Schism, when the Catholic Church split into the Eastern Catholic Church and the Western Catholic Church, and thought, well, maybe that's when things started really looking dicey about what unity was in Christianity. And then I kept dialing the clock back and arrived all the way back to about 38 AD or CE, when Jesus had handed his church on to his disciples. And suddenly there are all of these ideas floating around in the world of what Christianity is and what Christianity was. And you had the church in Jerusalem, and then you had Paul's churches, and then you had groups that were breakoffs from those groups, and all of these opinions floating around in the world about what Christianity was from the very beginning. And so if Christians are going to have any sort of foothold in this idea of exclusivism, we would have to go back 2,000 years and decide, well, who is right about what Christianity is, because there's been so many opinions floating around in the world. And that being said, we come back to where we are now and how we live together in unity with other people. I grew up in a tradition that does not need to be named that taught me that people like Shana and Jody, and sorry, Mary, we didn't know anything about the Quakers where I'm from. We're not going to inherit the kingdom of God because they didn't believe in Jesus, because they didn't express that faith. And I have never been able to really swallow that. The idea of my belief is that we're all created in the image of God, and that God must have some idea about how it all works out when different ideas pop up. We have to be able, as Shana has said so many times, and as all of these wonderful women have said so many times, we have to be able to look at each other and see ourselves as siblings. We can't go around slapping each other across the face with our various beliefs and saying, no, you've got to believe this way and it's got to be this way. We can have our strongly held beliefs. We can have our convictions about what our faith teaches us about things. I can go away from here tonight saying I am a devout Christian who believes in the teachings of Jesus Christ and everything that surrounds his ministry. And I can accept the fact that Mary has different beliefs than me, and that Shana has different beliefs than me, and Jody has different beliefs than me, and even Mary Lynn has different beliefs than me, believe it or not. But we're all people. We're all, as far as I can tell, created in the image of God. And we have a lot to learn from each other, and we have a lot that in listening we find in common with each other. So Christian exclusivism, our exclusive claims, Jesus says that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. What does that really mean? What are the larger implications of that statement? Is it about us having the right way? Or is it about the fact that we all have access to who God is, and we have the ability to ponder that question together wherever we find God? I think that is probably a more fascinating question about how we seek the face of God in all that we do, rather than trying to nitpick and trying to tear each other down. Find ways to build each other up and say, how can we live in community with each other and respect each other's beliefs and respect each other's dignity? And I think that's really where we need to be. You told me to be brief. I'm sorry.
Well, I think that's, Mike, is that where we need to end?
If either of you want to.
Yes, of course I have to respond, because if you want to trace Christianity back to like 30 AD, etc., you aren't going to find Christianity.
Right.
I mean, if Jesus were to come back and want to go to a house of worship, would he go to a church or a synagogue? Of course, the synagogue wasn't like the temple that he knew, etc., but there were synagogues. And that's where we all come together, though. And that's what we share. We all have different ways of looking at something that you can't really define. So we stumble around, do our best. We have this tradition, that tradition, etc. They're all incredibly beautiful. And it's sort of our Thursday morning women's clergy breakfast, where you've got 4 female clergy, all of different faiths, mine probably the most different, but it's like you wouldn't know we're different religions. You would think that we're all the same because we all have the same principles, the same love of God, and so much sharing. So even though there are ways that are different, the sharing is, and that's what makes us human.
Are there any questions from here, or can you see if there's anybody online who had a comment?
Well, no questions online just yet, but they've still got a couple of minutes if they want to put something in the chat box. I can see what's being typed here as I'm watching, but nothing's come in yet. So.
All right. Any final comments from our panelists?
This is a wonderful opportunity. It's a blessing.
I just have been thinking recently about all the calls for unity, and I think it's not so much unity. I mean, personally, I don't know that we'll ever be united in what we believe. I think what we should be calling for is respect for our differences. And that we can do.
I just want to say that as the only guy up here, it is great to be able to share this space and to be able to participate in this kind of dialogue with people that represent other faiths, and to be among, as I said before, such wise and learned women. I have plenty to learn as a Christian minister. I have plenty to learn as a child of God, but I think that in seeking each other's face and seeking each other's commonality, that is when we move towards a place of acceptance and tolerance and appreciation for who we are as individual people practicing our faiths out the best way that we can.
I thank you all for being here. We do have some refreshments for you if you wanted to spend a little time in conversation. Next month, we will have another panel discussion on the second Tuesday. Dr. Andrew O'Connor will be joining us for that panel discussion. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Mary. Glad you got home today.
Thank you so much.
I feel at a disadvantage. Being used to silence, I'm not used to thinking of things to say. Yeah, well, I have been thinking about it already.
Sorry.